If you guys thought my last video was speculative, then
Hold on to your lily white butts.
because this one is way more speculative. But as you know, I enjoy a nice bit of speculation, and this is a topic that I've wanted to do for a very long time. VLHADUS talked to me about doing this several months ago, and it took me a long time to figure out a way to actually do it. So thanks to VLHADUS for the idea, and be sure to go check out his latest video. So today we're going to try to come to an estimate of what the total player count might be at launch for Ashes of Creation. I'm going to look at it from multiple angles, using as much data as I can find. Keep in mind that gone are the days of having really accurate player counts in a lot of MMOs, back when developers used to release total subscriber counts. So that is where some estimation and speculation will come into play. Let's get into it. Let's start with this Steven quote.
When I think what the active player count will be on launch, I believe that we will launch with 1 million plus concurrent users.
Steven is estimating that Ashes will have over 1 million concurrent players at launch. So let's see if that is a fair assessment. Probably the easiest way to look at this is by looking at the most recent big MMO releases, New World and Lost Ark. The good thing about both of these MMOs is they were Steam exclusives, so we can get a very accurate concurrent player count. New World had a peak concurrent of 913,000 right after launch. Lost Ark had a peak concurrent of 1.3 million. When you consider the problems that both of these games had, New World was rushed to release with minimal content and massive game-breaking bugs, and Lost Ark being an isometric perspective MMO with a lot of pay to win, it is not hard to imagine if Ashes delivers on its promises that it could exceed these peak concurrent numbers at launch. But what about active players? Well, we don't have accurate information on the active player base for either game at their peak, but we could make some assumptions based on the concurrent numbers. First, you have to define what an active player actually is. In the past, MMOs were mostly subscription-based, and many of them released the active subscriber numbers. Now we don't have that, and both of these MMOs do not have subscriptions. So we probably want to exclude those that only log in for a few hours a month. So then what we could do is look at the estimated sales for New World in the first month. According to VG Insights, they estimate New World sold 4.5 million copies in the first month. If we assume that 70% of players played the game actively in that first month, then you would have an active player count of around 3.15 million. This gives a ratio of 3.5 for peak concurrent to active players, which we will use going forward. So if Lost Ark had 1.3 million peak players, then its active number using that 3.5 ratio would have been around 4.5 million players. Is that a conceivable number for Ashes to get to, or even exceed? Well, let's continue to do math stuff and try to find out. So we know that Steven said in the December 21 livestream they had over 3 million registered accounts on their website. I'm sure by now it is higher than that, but even at 3 million registered accounts, that could easily translate into Ashes exceeding Lost Ark's launch numbers. While I haven't been able to find any information on a valid ratio for how pre-registrations for a game translate into launch numbers, we can look at some alpha and beta test numbers for both New World and Lost Ark. For Lost Ark, they did a closed alpha test before launch that peaked at 15,500 concurrent. So the increase from that to launch peak was a massive 83.5. And yes, I know it was a closed alpha, but it was not hard to get into. New World had an open beta before launch that peaked at 142,000 concurrent. This gives a 6.5 ratio from the beta to the launch numbers. And for Ashes of Creation, we know that in the January livestream they mentioned having over 100,000 players signed up for Alpha 2. So with those numbers, hitting a concurrent player count of 30,000 is possible, which still is not enough to translate to a 1 million concurrent player count at launch, but consider that these players signed up to test an MMO that is still several years away from launch. All of these numbers, if Intrepid delivers, should go much higher. A safe assumption is the Ashes beta could have 10 times more players, which would translate to 1 million signed up for the beta and a peak concurrent of 286,000. Those 286,000 peak concurrent numbers could roughly translate to a peak concurrent of 1.9 million at launch, as well as around 6.65 million active players in the first month. Which again, with 3 million registered accounts, I don't think these numbers are impossible to reach at all. It all comes down to how well Intrepid executes on their vision. There's one final way we could approach this to make an estimate for the peak concurrent players at launch. We could look at the estimates for the current daily peak concurrent users for the most popular MMOs in the world. Now, as I said before, all the numbers I'm about to present are estimates, and one of the reasons I sat on this video idea for so long is because I couldn't figure out a great way to estimate these numbers. But with the recent Lazy Peon video where he talked about the most played MMOs, I decided to use his numbers. I did some double checking, and I think he did a great job with his estimates of these numbers. So here's the list of the most played MMOs with both daily peak concurrent and active monthly players. At number 1, we have World of Warcraft Retail and Classic with 1.25 million concurrent players. So for Ashes to reach 1.9 million peak concurrent at launch, it would temporarily have to be the number 1 most played MMO. And with the hype that always surrounds new MMO releases, and with all the big MMO streamers interested in this project, I think this is a realistic projection. So that is my prediction for this MMO, 1.9 million peak concurrent at the launch and close to 6.5 million active players. I know the copium comments are being furiously spammed in my chat at this very moment, led by the GOAT of Ashes commenters, my good friend Hill. But I think with the lack of quality new MMO releases that we have gone through for so long now, it is conceivable. But no matter what the launch looks like numbers wise, that really is not that important. What happens after that is way more important. I think that without question, Ashes will have a huge drop-off, just like every single MMO does. The first key question is how significant is the drop-off? If the drop-off is more than 50%, then that could be a very bad sign. And even worse is after the drop-off, if Ashes just sees a slow and steady bleed of its player base and doesn't start to see an uptick in its player base, then we could see some pretty bad outcomes for this project. If they don't manage to launch appropriately and open way too many servers to account for the rush of initial players, then have a mass exodus and do not grow after that, first of all, the major issues surrounding server merges with the node system could show up. And if that is mismanaged, it could further accelerate the loss of players. So I think it is critical that Ashes bucks the trend of new MMOs slowly bleeding players over time and instead sees growth post the initial launch hype and drop off. So all this speculation doesn't really matter. What matters is a month or two after launch and what the numbers look like then. That is all I have for this video. Consider subscribing if you haven't. With that, I'll see you guys in the next video.